Okay, the 2012 PPM had to change because we made significant changes in the 2010 UAM. And what we did, basically, we looked at the 2007 UAM, and there was a lot of things that we did routinely to grant exceptions for horizontal clearance. And it had a lot of criteria. It had 13 charts and graphs in there that allowed us to make decisions and basically spoke to when we would generally approve an exception. And we had utilities doing design work and designers evaluating hardships on utilities. And there's a lot of utility exceptions that we got routinely. We just approved. I think one year we got about 165 up here that we just rubber stamped and set on out. So we said there's got to be a better way. So let's change some of our horizontal clearance requirements to reflect the way we actually approve them. And let's eliminate these routine exceptions. Let's retain the design responsibilities for the roadside to DOT. Let those design responsibilities be with our designers and not be given over to the utility industry. Let the utility speak to their hardships and not have our designers trying to second guess what's a hardship to a billion-dollar industry. And eliminate the language in the charts indicating what DOT would generally do with respect to any exception. Basically what we were telling them, here's the rules and here's how to get around them. So we wanted to eliminate that. So we incorporated all that language or that wisdom into the 2010 UAM, but that was effective January 2011. So we had to take the 2009 UAM and we had to update it to the 2012, but the UAM was effective immediately and not effective upon the revision of the PPM. So what did we do? We created the infamous Bulletin RDB 11-11, which explained with using charts and graphs how to implement the 2010 UAM revisions. But now since we've published the 2012 Plans Preparation Manual, we no longer need that bulletin. In fact, the bulletin right now is ineffective. I don't know if anybody's went in to cancel it. If you read it, it says it's only effective until the 2012 PPM is published. So essentially the guidelines are gone and everything is incorporated into the Plans Preparation Manual that's necessary to fulfill what was in the bulletin. The main revisions were to Chapter 5, Chapters 2, 21, and 25, where we revised the horizontal clearance tables, and to Chapter 23, where we revised the design exception requirements. We had to define the responsibilities for design because we were separating the responsibilities between the UAO and the designer, which were intermingled in the 2007 UAM. We've revised the Chapters 2, 21, 25 for horizontal clearance requirements to reflect the requirements that we actually had in place without having to have exceptions processed for them automatically. And then we revised the design exception chapter to define what the designer's responsibilities were and defined what the utilities' responsibilities were. So let's look at Chapter 5. What was the main change there? Chapter 5, the main change or the main emphasis was brought to the very first sentence of the chapter. It says the designer is to make reasonable efforts to accommodate all existing utilities and any utilities to be constructed during the project. The designer is also responsible for identifying needed utility work. It doesn't mean he needs to know how to design a utility. He needs to know when it needs to be moved so it doesn't affect the project. Things that are out there that can be reasonably accommodated, they should be accommodated. If a design exception is required to reasonably accommodate it, the designer should do a design exception. He should be treating the utility just like any other object that's on the right-of-way. If we have a rock in the way and it can't be reasonably moved, well, then there's an exception you need to process. If a utility is in the way and it cannot be reasonably moved, then a design exception needs to be processed. If they can't be reasonably accommodated, then you need to move the rock or you need to order the utility to relocate. That was the major change in Chapter 5. There's some more revisions in Chapter 5 that go on to clarify work schedules, but that really hasn't changed, but this was more of a significant change. In Chapters 2, 21, and 25, that's where we made the changes to the Plans Preparation Manual to tell the designer how to design. We no longer send them to the Utility Accommodation Manual to have them read the law and figure out how to implement it. The law applies to the utility industry and tells them what their responsibilities are. When we have a designer on board, what we do is we tell him to design it as we say in the Plans Preparation Manual. If he follows that, he'll be in compliance with the UAM. He doesn't have to pick up the UAM and determine how to enforce the law. The UAM doesn't apply to all utilities anyway. It applies to permitted facilities, but facilities that are in their own easements or maybe there prior and had subordinated rights, they are governed by other things. So it wouldn't be fair to the designer to tell him to go figure all that out. He should design what needs to be designed, ask it to move no matter how it's there if it can't be reasonably accommodated. It'll be up to the utility coordinator to make the arrangements on work schedules. So let's go to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, the only thing we really changed was the table, telling what to do with above-ground fixed utilities. An above-ground fixed utility is an object that's over 4 inches above the grade. It's not crash-worthy, and it says so right there in the top. I hope you can see this pointer going across there. That's where you find out what the definition of an above-ground fixed utility is. It's the same definition used in the Utility Accommodation Manual. We've added 3 categories for utilities as opposed to treating everything the same. We have, what do you do when you have a brand new facility being placed on the right-of-way? What do you do when you have midspan pole, which is a pole that's being placed in an existing pole line, but it's a new pole. So it's not treated exactly as a brand new installation. And then we have existing above ground utilities, which are already there. So you have a project, they have things that are there, so they're treated differently than something that's never been there before. So for Table 2.11.3 horizontal clearance, this is for new construction. For new poles, you put them 4 feet from the face of curb, or you put them in the outside the recoverable terrain. Table 2.11.1, which has the new construction criteria. 55 miles an hour would be 36 feet. For midspan poles, you can install them within the line of the permitted facility, but if there's a crossing roadway, you have to stay out of the clear zone of that crossing roadway. For existing above-ground fixed utilities, they need to be relocated to 4 feet from the face of curb and outside the new construction recoverable terrain tables. So they have to be relocated to new construction criteria. If you notice there's a color change, this is for table 21. The only thing that changed in the table is the stuff that's highlighted in tan here. The names 21.2 horizontal clearance for above ground fixed utilities is for designs for the context sensitive designs for livable communities. One thing that we added was the control zones are not applicable to AFUs. That was not in the prior table because control zones are just new construction criteria anyway. We changed the 4 feet to 1.5 feet in these areas, and we reduced the recoverable terrain in those areas. So those tables are different. The new above ground fixed utility, which is a midspan pole, that hasn't changed. They're treated the same on the context sensitive designs as they are on new construction. And the existing above ground utilities are to be relocated to 1.5 feet from the face of the curb or to the reduced terrain recoverable terrain tables. The other table that was changed was chapter 25, which is for 3R projects. We retained the note that control zones are not applicable to AFUs. We went back to new construction criteria, which is 4 feet, or the new construction recoverable terrain. That's for anything that's brand new being placed on the project. Even if it's a 3R project, if it's a new facility, it meets new construction criteria. The midspan poles are treated exactly as the same as new construction or in the context-sensitive designs. The major difference on 3R and the area where we made the most significant changes to our exception process is that we allow existing AFUs to stay in place unless they are adjacent to an added lane or a widened lane. In other words, we've reduced the distance from the edge of the roadway to that pole, that existing pole, or it has been hit 3 times in 5 years. We do that because if it has not been hit 3 times in 5 years, we don't consider it a safety problem. And unless it's a safety problem, and we're not moving the roadway any closer to them, then we're going to accommodate them in the right-of-way. It may be moved, but it'll be moved probably during a new construction project or a reconstruction of the area, not during the resurfacing. If we move the lane closer, then we have to reevaluate it and decide to make it, to move it to the new construction criteria. So that's the main difference, is that if we permitted a utility pole and we have a project coming along and all we're doing is resurfacing the roadway, not moving any closer to it, and there has been no accidents out there, then we allow the pole to stay there until we come back with a reconstruction project or a new construction project through there and bring everything out to the highest standard. We did this because we granted exceptions after exception after exception because of these very things. So that's how we revised the horizontal clearance Now let's go into the exception process. The main difference in the chapter in 23 for exceptions and variations, which are for design exceptions when you're looking at design alternatives. We say that there are two approval processes used by designers. The exception process and variation process. If you have to reasonably accommodate a utility, or you should ask them to move if you can't. Those are all design decisions, and if you elect to allow it to stay, you should do an exception for it. Once a design exception has been done, then it can stay. If you do an exception and it shows that you can't justify it staying, or even if you decide that there's no sense in even doing an exception because it wouldn't prove that it could be reasonably accommodated, then the only option you have is to order the utility to relocate. Once you've ordered the utility to relocate, they are now obligated to relocate. And they have an exception process, which is the Utility Exception Procedure, topic 710.02.101, and that's to relieve them of their obligation to comply with a design requirement. So if they've been ordered to move, they have an obligation to comply with that design requirement. They can only alleviate themselves of that obligation by processing a utility exception. So that's what we did with Chapter 23. The utility exception process is not in the Plans Preparation Manual because designers do not do utility exceptions. It's in the Utility Accommodation Manual. It's actually in Chapter 5 under Utility Exceptions. Chapter 5 says that FDOT shall grant the requested utility exception when the information supplied by the UAO clearly shows that compliance with the listed section of the UAM is impracticable or would create an unreasonable hardship for the UAO. The key words are supplied by the UAO. The utility has to supply it. They have to request it. They have to show that it is impracticable or an unreasonable hardship. Those are things that our designer can't speak to. He's already done a design. He's already determined it should move. He cannot justify it with a design exception. If it could have been justified by a design exception, he should have justified it with a design exception and never obligated the utility to move. However, if the utility has to avail himself to this, it's because he's been ordered to move. It can't be justified that he stays. So he has to demonstrate the hardship of that order to move that would impose upon his company. No designer can talk to the utility's hardship. Only the utility can talk to the hardship. And impracticable, that means it can't be done. It's impossible. It was impossible to go to the moon until they developed the rocket. So once they developed the rocket, it was practicable to get to the moon. If you want to take a picture of the Earth, you don't have to go to the moon to do it. So it's practical not to go to the moon to take a picture of the Earth. But it is practicable to go to the moon to take a picture of the Earth. So that's really the difference between the terms practical and practicable. They have to demonstrate that it can't be done or that it is an unreasonable hardship. And those two things are left to the utility to justify. So, in summary, we've changed the horizontal clearance requirements, eliminated routine exceptions, and that's all because the 2007 UAM was revised, and now we've incorporated all those revisions into the 2012 PPM, where DOT retains the design responsibilities for the roadside. The UAO is given the responsibility to speak to a hardship, but not to the design. And we eliminated language and charts indicating what FDOT would do with respect to any exception.